Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Usually we give a little 2-minute warning, but we're just going to jump right into it, actually. Thanks for joining us. Just a quick heads up, we will be taking questions during the question period at the end, but you can tweet them all webinar long to @TheCircleCanada, and or you can add them directly into the chat box throughout the webinar. Feel free to indicate if the questions are for specific speakers or not. The webinar will be recorded and will be uploaded and shared after our broadcast. And again, just a reminder, we only have 100 live spots left. So if you happen to be one of those folks who shows up late to the party, you'll just have to wait till the webinar is available. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kris Archie, Wake Na Wake. I'm Secwepemc from Zeskin, which is a small community in British Columbia on my mother's side. On my father's side, I'm 4th generation settler Canadian, and I'm really thrilled to be hosting this particular conversation with 3 incredibly stellar folks. I'd like to acknowledge that the speakers today, so myself and the 3 other speakers, we're doing this conversation in two particular territories. So first, we have folks in the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Huron nations. And as well, for our folks over on the West Coast, they're sitting in the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Ah, look at those lovely faces. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. So we have 3 amazing folks joining us to share their wisdom. The first is Rudayna. She's the Manager of Stakeholder Engagement at InSpirit Foundation, as well as a Civic Action Diversity Fellow, a member of the Premier's Council for Youth Opportunities at MCYS. She's dedicated to supporting a more equitable future where we honor the treaties, eradicate anti-Black racism, and foster a more inclusive world. Welcome, Rudayna. Tanvi is a member of the Fresh Voices Youth Advisory Team and as well is a political science student at UBC. Welcome, Tanvi. I'm so excited to be chatting with you today. And as well, Nada. So Nada is the coordinator for refugees and new Canadian programs at SFU, which is Simon Fraser University in the West Coast, and is also a member of the Fresh Voices Initiative, which I know that they will tell you more about later. So welcome to our panelists.
Hi.
Hi. You guys can say hi if you want.
Okay, hi.
Hi. Great. Okay. So we're going to start jumping into the questions. One of the things I will just point out as well is that there are a reading list and resources available at the Circle's website. If you go to resources under publications and reports. And so some of what we're talking about, you will recognize has a connection to some of the resources that were shared beforehand. So one of the very first questions we wanted to work with is this question about the experience working as an Indigenous and or racialized woman in the philanthropic systems change nonprofit sector. And so I was asked to share a little bit about my experience and then open up to others. So I would say that one of the key experiences of being an Indigenous woman in the philanthropic sector is just the recognition for how few other Indigenous people there are working in the sector, which means it can sometimes feel very isolating. I think what the exciting opportunity is, though, is that I believe that Indigenous individuals and communities have a long history of understanding, kind of at a very kind of heart-centered level, the feeling and the experience of reciprocity and generosity. And so I think that it means for folks who are Indigenous working within the sector that there's so much of a gift that can be offered to the sector about what that's like. In addition to feeling a little bit lonely, but having this like worldview that's worth sharing, it can also be really overwhelming sometimes because being an individual kind of an individual from one particular lived experience or cultural background means that in lots of instances you might be required to speak on behalf of all Indigenous folks or all women, etc. And so that's a tricky balance and can be a bit much. But I think that's all I'll say for now. And what I'd like to do next is just invite Tanvi to also answer this question. What is your experience working as a racialized woman in this particular sector?
Thanks, Kris. First, I just want to echo the land acknowledgement because it's really important to the work that Fresh Voices does to understand and acknowledge the history of the land that we're on, and that's something that we're continuously trying to work on. So a little bit about what Fresh Voices is first, which is where me and Netta are from. It's a group of immigrant and refugee youth who work alongside adult allies to make sure that the voices of immigrant and refugee youth are heard in conversations about issues that affect us. And so this involves like making policy recommendations, but it also involves hosting dialogues and forums and awards for immigrant and refugee youth across the province so that they have the opportunity to talk about things, to advocate, and to identify barriers that they face. Yeah, we've been doing this work since 2011 is when Fresh Voices started. I've been a member of the team for about 5 years. And since then, I mean, part of what we have been working with is this idea of like justice, and the idea that justice needs to be for everyone, that it can't just be for one community or the other. It can't be for immigrants or refugees. It has to be for all of us, in solidarity with Indigenous communities, in solidarity with not just youth, but other generations of immigrants and refugees. So we work, so my experience, I guess, as a racialized woman in this sector has been pretty good because I've been surrounded by really amazing people, but we're also like constantly struggling with the idea of how do we bring more people in and how do we make this experience as good for everyone? How do we work together?
Nice. We feel like this. Sorry, Kris. I think the challenge is that there aren't enough spaces like Fresh Voices, and so there are so many people that would like to be part of such work, but there aren't. We don't, as Fresh Voices, we don't have the capacity to have everyone join us as part of the core team. But it's also a good challenge as well, because to know that there's so many people that want to be part of the work, and now it's about, okay, how can we make space for our very diverse communities to come together and do this work.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, it becomes so essential to make sure that folks have an opportunity to come together, right? To do their own work around the things that are important for them. Thank you both for that. Next up, we have a slide that I think is very interesting. I'm going to invite Rudayna. Having worked in the philanthropic sector, can you share with us your experience in the sector, as well as share what conversations you think that philanthropy should or could be having? And for those of you who are seeing the slides, you're getting a bit of a sneak peek of what I imagine Rudayna will school us on here. Thanks.
Yeah, it's great to hear from all three of you about your experiences. I have to say I'm doing a lot of nodding over here. So yeah, I've worked in philanthropy for about a year. I've been with the Inspirit Foundation. And I'm heartened to see a lot more folks in the sector striving for more equitable practices and to create more equity within our country. And really beginning to grapple with the recognition that our sector's resources are based in an economic inequity. So how do we really get beyond that? And recognizing that not all of us have been able, historically or presently, been able to accrue such wealth in the same way. So really seeing, unfortunately, a lot of the time still, a lot of the leadership lacking voices from the communities we look to serve. And that's really about what this stat here is about. So it's not enough to just say, well, shift resources to Indigenous communities or racialized communities. We need to incorporate these folks' voices from the get-go. So really say, like, helping decision-making of who gets funds, when they get funds, how they get funds. It's not enough to just be on the receiving And so this was just an interesting stat I saw from the Ontario Nonprofit Network, pointing to culling information from 800 executive directors of nonprofits and senior staff, and at least 87% of them are white folks. So it's interesting because I hear us talk about how primarily our sector is based as women, and we're clearly less comfortable talking about this stat because it was a new one to me until more recently. And so how often are we really working without lived expertise at the table, given this? And I say lived expertise really intentionally, because I think sometimes we say lived experience and it's sort of not taken seriously as a really important capacity that is just more often seen amongst Indigenous and racialized communities because of the ways we're read and the ways we move through the world. So I think we really need to ask if we're just checking off lived experience, and because I think we're really at risk of both trivializing how important that is and also tokenizing the person we've appointed to fill that space. So a person, like you said, Kris, because that can then feel like they have to speak for the whole community. And then what are the ways in which putting them in a position to speak from just indigeneity or just their Blackness really keeps them from being able to share all their other expertise? We really can't do that to people. We need to help people and support people to show up with their full selves with all their skills and their gifts intact. And then even from that point, it's not enough to just see different faces at the table. I think we need to also get beyond representation and see what it looks like to really challenge a lot of these systems that are based in colonial structures. We need to create space for people to be more progressive, more imaginative, and really talk about and imagine what philanthropy can look like, rather than just, filling the status quo.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. There's so much there. I mean, I really appreciate that idea of just getting beyond representation. It is really true that, the slide that you have up about it's not enough to just bring people who might have particular knowledge. Those that kind of bring a lived experience can help connect the dots in more meaningful ways. And there's a real opportunity. There is a bit of this myth, and I've heard it more in the US, but I feel like it's something that's just worth saying. That there's this idea that people of color or Indigenous people just aren't interested in actually taking up places of power and or engaging in leadership in the nonprofit sector. And so just really quickly, I'll ask each of you, are you interested in seeing yourself in positions of leadership and or know other people of color or racialized folks who would also like to see themselves in positions of power within the nonprofit sector?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that we have so many people who are like amazing leaders, and they would go on to do a great work, but they need to be given that opportunity to do that.
Mm-hmm. Which really, I think, requires folks being willing to kind of to step aside and to create more opportunities for leaderships of all kinds to show up, for sure. Well, I mean, I think that this is a really great segue into our next conversation, which is just a recognition that we can't achieve justice if we're not standing united. And so really, we've asked and titled this webinar around the role of allyship, kind of what it entails, why is it necessary? And the one thing that I think is really important to note as well is that, and this is I think this is an emergent conversation in the broad community, that there is an importance to understanding what it is to be an ally, and also an importance to recognizing that there are specific, tools and knowledge that a person could learn, while also remembering that that it's about the community who sees you as an ally, who names you as such. That's really important. And so also, as you answer these next questions, I invite you to share, if you're comfortable, not just about what it is to be an ally, but as well to what it is to be an accomplice in this work toward justice. And so I believe I'm going to hand this over to Nada to just share with us, like, why is this necessary? And do you think there's space for this actually in our professional practices?
Yeah, so, well, like, to me, allyship is a lifelong commitment. It's not just one instance of just saying the right thing and that's it. But no, it's a commitment. It's ongoing, right? And it's intentional. And I totally agree with you. I think it's not. I don't think we should, like, I shouldn't come and say, oh yeah, I'm an ally. It should be other people recognizing that and calling me an ally or not, because it's so easy for me to go around and be like, oh yeah, I'm a wonderful ally. You know, I practice allyship all the time, and we see people do that often, even though they don't really meet the requirement of being, or they don't really understand what allyship means. I think it's, to touch back on your question, why do we need to do this together? Like, why? I think it's impossible for us to achieve like equity and social justice if we don't stand united. The systems around us are just so oppressive and so strong that it's very difficult for us to dismantle those systems and change them if we're doing it alone. So that's one thing. So what we have to stand united in this fight, and it's also because we share, like, we do have a lot of differences. Like, I mean, even if we talk about just the immigrant or refugee community, like, we talk about it as if it's one thing, but it's really, really diverse. And despite all of those differences between whether it's immigrant or racialized communities or indigenous communities, I think we share a lot of common things and a lot of similarities. And if we focus on those similarities and work together, we're more likely to achieve our goals. And as you mentioned earlier, Kris, it gets lonely sometimes, and so we need to support one another, because this is a path that's it's difficult, and we're constantly being put down, and we're constantly fighting, and if we don't support one another, if we don't stand for each other and be there for one another, I don't think we can continue to do this work. So it's like, we really need to be there for each other. Like, I totally hear you with what you say. Like, right now, the places that I occupy and the places that I am, I'm the only, or like, I find myself within the minority of racialized people in the room, and it's challenging to constantly be the voice that goes like, oh no, but you know, like, you shouldn't be saying this, or like, this is racist, or this is like, and it's a burden. It's a struggle, because you have to be advocating and challenging systems all the time, and it would be nice to have. It's always amazing to have people who truly practice allyship around us. And also, the other thing I want to say is that, like, most of our work as Fresh Voices is focused on migrant justice and like, you know, the experience of refugee and immigrant racialized youth. However, like, we truly believe that there's no such thing as migrant justice without indigenous justice, and the two are really connected. It starts from acknowledging first, when we come here, well, this land, we cannot achieve justice if we are standing on stolen land. So let's, like, start from the beginning and work from there. But also, like, we are indigenous elsewhere. Like, yes, we're immigrants to this land, but we're indigenous elsewhere from the places that we come from. And a lot of our communities know have been colonized and know what it's like, and the impact of colonization. So I think it's not like, when we do practice allyship, especially when it comes to the indigenous communities, it's not about, you know, like, doing it because we want to or because we're expecting something in return, but it's really a responsibility that it's something that we should be doing because it's our responsibility, right? And we shouldn't be expecting, you know, like, we shouldn't be expecting people to, like, applaud us for doing it, because this is the least, like, really the least that we could be doing, and there's so much more that we need to do in regards to allyship, especially with Indigenous communities.
Yeah. Well, and so I just want to take a moment to just acknowledge some of what you said there that's really powerful, which is that, you know, being an ally is about action and it's about advocacy. And additionally, it's about recognizing where we have some shared lived experience between Indigenous and racialized folks. And so I really appreciate that kind of acknowledgement. I think that's an important thing that there are likely many organizations or individuals in this work aren't necessarily thinking about. And I know that recently the work of Fresh Voices did some grant making and did a really cool video project. And so could you share a bit about that, Tanvi?
Yeah, so Access to Media Education Society, or AIM, started this project called Displacement, which actually Kris was a facilitator, and a few of Fresh Voices members were a part of it, including myself. And it brought together Indigenous, immigrant, and refugee young people to make films, like short films around the topic of displacement and what that means to us. And it was a really interesting experience for a lot of us, because I think one of the things we realized is that there's a lot of overlap in our experiences, and there's also a lot of differences that we need to acknowledge. And it was interesting to see that spaces like these, where you can bring together immigrant, refugee, and Indigenous communities, don't really exist. And this was one of the few spaces that aimed to do that. And there were challenges involved with it, but there was also a lot of impact, and a lot of us came to realize how important doing this work really is. And even when we're showcasing these films actually at an event on December 8th, which if you want to learn more about, you can go to the Fresh Voices website. And as we're coming up with the plan for this event, we're talking about bringing in people who are doing work that bridges gaps between immigrant, refugee, and Indigenous communities, and realizing that there aren't actually that many people, and that this is an area that we all need to work harder at, and to bridge the knowledge gap between our communities and also within our own communities.
Absolutely. I think that's a really key point that comes back to this piece Nada said about there is no migrant justice without Indigenous justice. And so it's been really exciting to kind of watch the work of displacement continue to evolve. And you know, I think that there's lots of learning that the broad community can get from witnessing the way in which Fresh Voices has been working to engage the Indigenous community in their work. So that's really awesome. So before we move to our next slide, I just want to remind people again that you're able to send us questions and send questions to our fabulous speakers through the chat box, as well as you can tweet to @TheCircleCanada for more commentary, etc. Also, just a quick plug, if you're enjoying this webinar so far, know that next year the Circle is going to be launching a new online conference series, and we'll be really focused about learning through dialogue. So we're excited to share more information with you in the new year. So over to our next slide, which is really about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. And so one of the things that I noticed recently at a conference a few weeks ago, they had these lovely little booklets. And I had this kind of realization, this remembering of the fact that the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, are actually broken into these kind of two big sections. You know, it opens with some principles and preamble, which are really key. But the two sections are the first kind of 42 or so call to actions are all around acknowledging and working to dismantle the existing colonial legacy that comes from Indian residential schools. And it's the next 42 that are really focused on the ways in which we can increase and participate in reconciliation. And so I just invite people to go back to that document to, you know, if you have the ability, read the whole publication by the TRC. It is 2 volumes. It's quite moving. So yeah, I just wanted to add that piece. But I want to invite Rudayna to share with us the calls to action that you're particularly interested in speaking about and kind of working to striving towards in your own work.
Yeah, thank you for that. I definitely try and read the calls to action, thinking about what my role can be in any of them. And then when I think about some of the ones that are I guess, most key to me, I think of call to action 66, which is particularly relevant in my work. So the In-Spirit Foundation being focused on increasing inclusion across Canada, and with particular focuses on advancing reconciliation and addressing Islamophobia. And one of the main focuses we have on that is supporting change leaders. So folks from 18 to 34 who have lived experience of some of these issues and are really the like sort of key change agents. So number 66 is something that I've heard from Indigenous youth that we work with, who also work with Indigenous young people in their communities, as being really important. And we really definitely see the sparks fly in idea sharing when we bring together, for instance, a young Indigenous person from Thunder Bay with together with like Indigenous young people from Halifax. So really exploring how we can continue to be of support to building this network is something that is really in the forefront of my mind oftentimes, and we're in talks with other foundations too who have similar priorities and want to help contribute to that network. Number 93, newcomers to Canada, is one that is important to me and also strikes on a personal note. So my parents, respectively being from Eritrea and Yemen, came to Canada in seek of safety opportunities. And on the one hand, like I'm very cognizant that I've lived a good life that might not have be possible in the same ways had we not come here. And then at the same time, it wasn't until quite a bit after my family's arrival, just prior to when I was born, that they really started to know the violence perpetuated on these lands towards Indigenous people. And so there's a troubling way in which like fleeing a colonized country to unknowingly coming into another really perpetuates the violent ways in which this country has tried to erase Indigenous peoples. And so how are we accidentally participating in that by not knowing the histories on these lands? So I think 93 is super critical. And as we start to become more honest about our history, there's still so much that we're not talking about, whether it's the enslavement of Indigenous peoples alongside the enslavement of Black folks on these lands. So there's still, even beyond with newcomers, like so much unlearning and learning that so many of us have to do.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I think that I remember being quite surprised several years ago when I was able to connect with a group of young folks called New You and My Circle. And that's when I was informed that newcomers to Canada really didn't receive any information at that time about Indigenous peoples, the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people of this country. And so I think that there are these little pockets where this work is happening, but it's certainly not enough. So appreciate you kind of highlighting that, and also just highlighting that call to action 11, which is about ensuring the knowledge about treaties and the history of residential schools kind of broadly, not just in schools, but like publicly it needs to be present as well. Thank you for that. So, I mean, the connection to this piece of the TRC is really about the ways in which we can all come together to take action. And I think that one of the ways that's easiest to take action is really in using our voice, right? In using our physical presence. And so I want to kind of move towards this, this question about the voices that we need to elevate, and whether there might actually be the need to lower the volume on some voices and or practices in the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. And so I'm going to turn this over first to Nada.
Well, I mean, the answer to your question is pretty simple. Like, which voices have we not been hearing from, or which voices are often not included in conversations, and those are the voices that we need to elevate, right? And it's usually voices of marginalized communities that have been excluded from this. I also want to note that, like, and it kind of touches back to what Rudayna said earlier, having them in the room, having those marginalized people in the room doesn't mean that they're actually being heard, or that they're, because I often find, so for example, I get invited to a lot of events to speak and to be part of conversations, but I don't know, I think sometimes we're just being tokenized, right? So we have that person of color in the room, or that racialized person in the room, and then, okay, it's a check mark. We've done our part, we have someone, and that's it. So we need to be very careful on what does it mean to actually include those people coming from marginalized communities, to be part of the conversations, to be heard, right? They need to be, the stats that you just shared about how many people in, like, was it 87% that you just said, are in, 80% really
of the executive directors in Ontario are white.
Right. Like that's shocking, but it's at the same time, it's not surprising, because we experience that in almost everywhere I go. Like, the higher up you go in all institutions and nonprofit sector and all of them, the more you see the dominant group occupying those spaces, and very few the racialized people in those spaces. So not that we're saying that those people don't have anything to add, or that their contribution is not valued. I think they bring a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom, and they should be heard as well. But we need to make sure that to include the voices of people, like, we need to hear the diversity from very diverse groups, and also especially when we're discussing issues that impacts those marginalized communities, because who else would know their issues more than them, and who else would know what they need more than them, right? So if we're talking about, I don't know, if we're talking about the settlement sector, working with immigrants and refugees, and who are the people making decisions in those sectors? If we're talking about whatever it is, like, we need to have the group of people that are making decisions should be reflective of the population that they are serving.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very much so, about making sure that those who are impacted by the decisions we're trying to make should be in the room and actually have some kind of power and authority to impact those decision making mechanisms. It's such an important concept to also think about, this idea of transaction and transformation, and that what I've been finding is that how important it is to even just invite the conversation about transaction and transformation when I'm invited somewhere, when people invite me to speak or come to an event or be present in a conversation. I've started by just asking people, is this a transaction kind of situation? Would you like me to be present, to fulfill a particular quota of either being a woman or an Indigenous person, et cetera? Or would you like to make sure that there's an opportunity for transformation, which means that there will be, folks who are skilled in hearing the voices of others? And I find that often that question is just enough to help folks pause and kind of come to understand or recognize the ways in which they're kind of unconsciously biasing and or continuing to make space for the voices that we already hear far too much. So I'm going to ask Rudayna, can you also share a bit more on this idea of voice and really around the connection to the philanthropic sector?
Yeah, I love that question so much, Kris. I'm definitely making a mental note of that. I feel like I totally agree with what Netta is saying. So maybe I'll speak a little bit more on the practices that we need to maybe increase or decrease. I think we need more transparency. We need more transparency of our, granting streams, of the ways that we can share power in determining granting, whether it's external reviewers and some good practices like that. I think particularly some like private and family foundations and things like that might not have the same requirements as public foundations as well. And I think we all need to be streaming for more equitable and transparent practices. I think we need more accountability to young people. So creating structures where they can really make decisions. And so I don't just mean like having these youth advisory boards, but really being sure that we're positioned to take their feedback into account and really ready to act on that. Because we can't continue to waste young folks' time, as good as the intentions might be, and we don't want to sometimes perpetuate like the exclusion they can face in those times where you know, they might give you really good feedback and then you're not necessarily ready to react to it. And I think we also need to hear a lot more from young people in northern communities and in rural areas. I think that we're still bodies that are heavily operating in urban spaces, and there's good work to be done there, but I think we need to go further as well.
Absolutely. On that last point, I know that that's something that Fresh Voices and many of the circle members have been really focusing on more, is recognizing that there is not enough inroads or space for people in rural and northern communities anywhere in Canada to really impact policy and or research in a way that can be quite meaningful. And I know that there's some amazing groups doing that work, but it's just not happening enough. If there are folks out there listening and they're interested in kind of what it looks like and or feels like to be part of a meaningful exchange with northern communities, I would recommend that you connect with Itua Scott Enns from the Arctic Funders Network, because they're doing some really great work to kind of very much center the voices of folks from the north in their grant making. So thank you for that piece on the practices specifically. One of the things that we've been chatting about already that's coming up through all of your conversations, of course, is about the ways in which the philanthropic sector can work to ensure that those who are marginalized and or come from racialized communities are able to engage in this work. And so you've talked about things like, you know, making sure that there's spaces, ensuring that there's an opportunity for voice to be heard, and also making sure that decision making actually, and the power of providing voice leads to decision making that's followed up on. And so I'd like to just expand a bit more on this question, which is about, you know, how does philanthropy have to change to better work with communities? And I think I would like you to just add, if possible, how is it that the philanthropic sector can benefit from actually making space for Indigenous and or racialized communities to engage in the sector more broadly? And so I think I'll come right back to you, Rudayna.
Yeah, I think that building on the previous point, we need more direct channels with Indigenous and racialized young folks. So people who can really, in relationships where people can really shape the ways in which organizations show up and really determine the terms of those relationships. I think that would lead to us granting and working in much more effective ways, and ways that would actually address the roots of problems rather than just the ways that we see the problems. I think we also need to be prepared to be much more flexible. So not necessarily set in our ways about the supports we're ready to extend, especially if we're entering a particular community, but really being able to let folks tell us what the plan is and how they want us to support those plans. I think we really need to put away those paternalistic assumptions of like, well, this worked great here, so it's probably going to work great here. So really being prepared to being told how we can provide support as opposed to telling folks the ways that we're interested in supporting. And I think that would be a much better, much more effective way to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, listening, I think, is a key aspect of a shift that's required, right? Some kind of deep listening, and I think additionally that how important it is for folks in the philanthropic sector to become in stronger relationship to themselves and to then the resources that they have stewardship over, because those are the things that will help build different kinds of relationships, I think, in these particular communities. Tanvi, can you tell me your response to this. I mean, you've been working with the Vancouver Foundation and Fresh Voices. Can you share a bit of your thinking on what needs to change?
I think I'm going to echo a lot of what everyone said, because you guys have covered it in a lot of ways. But I think that one of the problems in the sector is that a lot of it is about consulting communities, consulting them once and then leaving it and then doing whatever we think is best. And one of the things I appreciate about Fresh Voices is that we let the affected communities lead. It's not other people doing work for immigrant and refugee communities, it's immigrant and refugees doing the work. And so I think there needs to be more of that, of letting communities identify their own barriers and letting them lead the charges forward, and to create ongoing dialogue so that we're avoiding tokenization, so that we're not just consulting people once and then letting that conversation end, so that we're continuing those conversations as we do the work and asking what we can do better. I also think that we need to ask ourselves questions before we even start, before we start taking initiative on new projects. We need to ask why we're doing this, who benefits from it, whose voices need to be elevated, and also what barriers prevent people from getting involved. Because one of the things we've realized is that a lot of people want to lead, and a lot of people have amazing knowledge to share, but there are really real barriers that prevent people from coming into these spaces. So even things like providing bus tickets, we try to do that for all our events, because it allows people who might not be able to afford public transit, which is pretty expensive, to be able to attend these events without that financial burden. And it's important, because if we're not doing this, we're not going to come up with real solutions if we're not creating them alongside or led by the communities who are affected by them. And we're also losing out on all of the knowledge that people bring.
Absolutely. Would you be willing to share the ways in which organizations could take steps to kind of decenter the whiteness of their work? And I asked this, anyone could respond. I asked this because I think that there's a lot of conversation these days about the specific practices that can be taken to decenter whiteness in conferences and at meetings. Do any of you have a particular way that you like to plan for a meeting that helps decenter the dominant way of being and doing?
I can maybe speak to it a little bit. I don't have necessarily solutions, but I was at an event recently where the organizer had sort of 3 circles of dialogue. So when the event opened up, it was only the people who were directly affected by the issues who were invited to speak and engage in the conversation. And then 15 minutes in, it was opened up to people who are working with people who are directly affected by issues. And then the very last bit of the event, everyone who was in the room was invited to speak. And I felt like it was really powerful, because the voices that mattered most were highlighted, and it wasn't like everyone else was excluded from the conversation, but it was very important that those voices were the most important. Yeah.
That's amazing. That sounds like a really awesome kind of event. Anyone else want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I love that. I think asking ourselves a lot of questions. I think the questions that Tanvi mentioned are really critical, particularly in the philanthropy sector, and around who's benefiting from the work, and also who's leading. I see a lot of organizations interested in taking up this work, which is really exciting. And then I think they know that they need folks with lived experience, and so they bring those folks on. But those folks aren't necessarily in the decision-making seats, and they aren't really driving the project. And so it's still not sufficient. If you want to be a person to lend resource who doesn't have that lived experience and wants to lend resources, lend space, provide your organizational support and throw that behind people with lived experience, great. But it can't just be a matter of employing people in projects who don't necessarily have the leadership that is needed for them to do this work in a good way. I think in the philanthropy sector, we also need to be asking ourselves questions when we see granting applications, especially from people with lived experience of, because I see particularly from young racialized folks, these grant applications that promise huge outcomes, and they're grants for, you know, $10,000. And so that's wonderful, but also, are they paying themselves? Because oftentimes that's not the case. And I think we really need to be mindful of not perpetuating the economic inequity that we're looking to avoid and deconstruct. So making sure that even folks that we're supporting are able to take care of themselves and compensate themselves for their important work. And then also working from their definition of success. I think oftentimes we have a sense of what we hope our grants to do, but just making sure that we're throwing our support behind what other people envision for the success of their project that's being funded. Amazing.
Yes. So many yeses, so many nods and smiles over here where I'm at. I think this has been really interesting to see the questions that are coming through, both through the chat box and through the Twitter feed. And so I'm excited to find ways to continue working to answer those questions online and in other places. You know, one of the questions that we hear often, that I imagine Tanvi, Nada, and Rudayna, you hear often as well, is from folks who, you know, aren't Indigenous or racialized, who, you know, are really keen to do the right thing and get engaged and to be an ally, but don't really know where to begin. And so one of and this is a question that comes up in almost all of our webinars and in most conversations. One of the things that I would invite people to do is to really focus in on the importance of beginning to do your own personal work and invest your own time and energy in the understanding of the true history of the particular land that you live in, not just Canada broadly, but the specific geographic region that you're existing within. Because often it's important to do that kind of personal work before trying to build out meaningful relationships in professional settings. But that's definitely a question we've heard before, and we'll make sure that we do what we can to provide that as an answer. It looks like we just lost Rudayna. Oh dear, I think she's coming back though, so that's good.
She's back.
Oh, okay, great.
I'm so sorry.
You were gone and back before I even noticed. You did some magic.
You didn't
there.
lose me during my last answer?
Pardon?
You didn't lose me during my last answer? Because that's what I got cut out.
No, but it didn't sound like we did. I heard a pause and then I started chatting. So hopefully there was a natural segue, I felt like. So one of the things, one of the questions that we got, so just so those our webinar panelists know, I'm looking at a phone over here where the Twitter feed has been coming in. So there's a couple of questions I just want to address directly before I open up for maybe one final question before we close. There's a question here about that stat, you know, about ONN stat, about 87% of executive directors being white. And the question was about, well, you know, maybe that stat is skewed because we don't even know, you know, the particular population demographics of Ontario. And the one thing I would just say to that is just that there is an undeniable recognition that the philanthropic sector, especially the leadership of the philanthropic sector and the nonprofit sector at large, absolutely does not reflect the lived experience of the majority of the people they're seeking to serve. That's undeniable. That's unquestioned. And so I would just invite for that particular question to be thinking, that person be thinking about the ways in which we are so uncomfortable with just plain straight up acknowledging that reality in the sector. It's kind of one of those like shadow sides of the nonprofit sector that can be really uncomfortable to just look at. But it's something that we definitely need to be aware of and find more comfort in talking about it. So one of the last questions that I'll just ask, I mean, there are so many questions here. We'll have to continue to get to them. And Nada, Tanvi, and Rudayna, I hope that you will join us online on Twitter and throw in your wisdom here, as well as invite your other communities online to engage in the conversation too. I think that the last question I really want to ask is to each of you. Just if you could ask the nonprofit sector if you could invite the nonprofit sector to ask itself one question, what would that question be? And yeah, and then we'll head into closing remarks there. I can't see you, so I imagine you're all just sitting there smiling and being polite, which is fine. I also know that you have all provided so much provocative thinking and even already given examples of some really fantastic questions already, and so we can continue to highlight those. And so I think that there's another question that we got as well, which could be interesting to respond to online, and so I'll save it for that. This is how I'm trying to keep people engaged, keep you speaking.
I can also jump in to answer your previous question if you like.
Okay, sure.
Okay, sorry. I think really asking what's our role in any given situation. I think there is a lot of ways in which there is a desire to show that organizations are doing good work, which is important, but then also what are the ways that instead perhaps folks should be leading from behind, or really supporting with regards to resources and perhaps not being the ones setting the agenda or something like that. So I think with every project, it's really important, especially in communities that the organization might not be intimately connected to, asking what's our role and really how can we support this in a meaningful way that doesn't step on other people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I think I'd have so many questions. I just don't know how to choose. I think one of the things I would want them to ask themselves is okay, what's the intention? What's the reason that they're doing the work that they're doing, and then find ways to measure it. Are they actually achieving it? Because I feel usually a lot of the organizations in the nonprofit sector, they lose sight of the people that they serve, and then it becomes a really ugly space, really. So yeah, remember why we're doing this work, and then and how can we make it? See, now I'm jumping to so many other questions, but how can we? So basically assessing the process and how can we make it better by involving those communities that we are serving in the decision making.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. I think that this has been a fantastic conversation, and I am so much more. I mean, I already knew I was going to hear brilliant things, but I'm just so much more grateful and wiser for having the opportunity to listen to the three of you on this. And I'm certain that the number of folks who are listening live and to the rest of the folks who will listen to this recorded webinar have so much to gain from asking themselves and their organizations these questions, and really, doing that personal work to engage with this issue of being an ally, of engaging in reconciliation through their personal action and behavior. So I'd like to thank you, the three of you, so much for this. And just I'm going to shamelessly plug a few of the pieces of work that the Circle is doing over the next year that folks could be engaged in. So one of the things we're really committed to is kind of increasing opportunities for different kinds of experience so that people could spend time doing their personal reflection and then engaging with one another in the sector. And so if you haven't had an opportunity to take a look at the pre-reading resources for this webinar or other webinars that the Circle has done, please do that. Please share with your colleagues and have conversations. Do your personal reflection and be willing to dig deeper and engage with the material that especially makes you feel uncomfortable and defensive or guilty. You know, I think that those are the specific opportunities for stretching our learning and our practice that really is that's going to benefit the nonprofit and the philanthropic sector most broadly. Additionally, what we have heard a ton of is that there are many philanthropic organizations across Canada that are really seeking to engage much more deeply in the idea and the practice of reconciliation. And so in spring of 2018, the Circle will be launching a peer-based learning opportunity for staff working in the philanthropic sector called Foundations Partnering for Reconciliation. And this allows folks to come together and do some shared learning about the ways that they're breathing life into the declaration of action. So if you'd like more information, please feel free to get in touch with us. Please keep the conversation going online by tweeting to @TheCircleCanada and using the hashtag #ReconciliationInAction. And again, one more final thank you to all of the folks who are listening. I hope that you will keep these conversations alive in your organizations. I hope that you'll continue to ask yourself and those in positions of power and leadership in your organization challenging questions as well. I invite you guys who are out in the world of interwebs, consider hosting a lunch to keep this conversation alive. Do creative and exciting things to keep moving the conversation and the work forward. So with that, I hope everyone has a fantastic afternoon and just would like to thank you again for joining us. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.